Welcome everyone, and just let you know this is one in a series of workshops we've been hosting, partially funded by a grant from CAL FIRE since 2018. We have funding in this region through March of 2022 to continue to host these outreach and educational events, and most of them we've been trying to do live fire participation. We've had pretty good luck with that, and I think we do have a good chance of being able to do that with this workshop as well. And I just wanted to thank all the collaborators, including Dan and Cordy Craig and Allison Ernie from the Placer Resource Conservation District, who pulled together to make this happen very quickly. That was all I wanted to say, Dan. If you have any specific questions about that, just shoot me a text or a private text or whatever you'd like. I'd be happy to respond.
Well, great. Thank you, Susie, very much. And I also do want to introduce Cordy Craig and Allison Ernie from the Placer Resource Conservation District, who've been great partners in putting this together, and they're doing a lot of on-the-ground work with landowners. So Allison and Cordy, I don't know if you guys want to say a few words before we roll into the first presentation.
Sure. This is Allison. I'm the forester at the Placer RCD. Really grateful for Susie coming to us to put this workshop on today. So thanks, Susie.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Allison said. I'm the project coordinator for Placer RCD, and basically we received a grant from CAL FIRE to write a white paper and identify some of the barriers and solutions to prescribe fire as a land management tool for private landowners. And so since beginning this project, we found that one of the primary barriers was that landowners felt they lacked the experience and confidence. And so Susie and Dan both kind of chimed in and said, hey, maybe we can put on a workshop. So I feel like everything came together really well. So we're excited to put this on.
Thank you both. It's been definitely a partnership effort here. So thank you for stepping up. And it's been exciting to get this put together in such a short time frame. Just very briefly, I do want to acknowledge Alan and Nancy Edwards of Edwards Family Tree Farm up in Colfax, who will be hosting us tomorrow. I've known Alan and Nancy for a very long time, and they've always been really gracious about hosting all kinds of fun things at their operation in Colfax. And I think it's really unique to have an opportunity to work with a working landscape landowner doing this type of outreach. So we'll get to meet Alan and Nancy tomorrow, but thank you both for hosting us tomorrow and for a subsequent burn day. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker tonight. Another colleague of mine from up in Humboldt-Del Norte County, Jeff Stackhouse, is the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor up there and has been working with the ranching community for a long time now on reintroducing fire on working landscapes up there. And so, Jeff, I'll let you do the more thorough introduction of your program and what you do up there. But thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for getting cleaned up before you got on screen.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me tonight. Again, my name's Jeff. I work in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, primarily with beef and dairy operations. But when we talk about prescribed fire, it's only on beef operations because the dairymen are working on the best prime ground, which is, flat and all irrigated. So I'm talking mostly from my experiences working with cattle ranches, but I think it's important to note that these cattle operations, although they really enjoy wearing a broad rimmed hat, a lot of times the timber is what actually pays the bills. In Humboldt County, because we're very good at growing trees, and trees are very good at encroaching on grasslands and oak woodlands. So a lot of our work actually is to trees from encroaching on grasslands and oak woodlands to preserve the cattle component of these ranches. So that's a little bit of a background, and I put together a quick talk kind of to give a background of how the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association started, what we're doing, and you know, without further ado, I'll try to get that moving here. So,
Hey, as you talk, if people have questions, do you want them to put it in the chat box or to raise their hand? What would you like?
whatever works. I guess just interrupt me is probably the easiest thing. There's not that many folks on the screen, I think, tonight. What, we had less than 50? Yeah, so if you have a question, just go ahead and interrupt me, jump in, and we can address it there. And yeah, I think it'll be fun and easy that way. So at any rate,
Please
Okay,
be sure
so-
to mute yourself.
yeah, so if you're a private landowner, like what are your options if you're interested in prescribed fire? I think that's the first place to start before we get into what we've been doing in Humboldt County, because the options are the same everywhere in the state. And there's essentially 4 options, and all 4 options are completely relevant and very good options. And it really kind of depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So the first one is the one that I grew up with as a child. I grew up on a small sheep ranch in Shasta County. We only had 400 acres, but both of my parents are registered professional foresters and are very into prescribed fire. And this is the option that we use on our ranch, and it's the do-it-yourself option. And the pros of the do-it-yourself option are you're in charge, right? And you get to do it when and how you want. Typically incredibly low cost, if any cost at all. I mean, you're paying for fuel and a drip torch, and maybe paying for a drip torch if you don't have one. And the environmental compliance is relatively simple, if not non-existent, right? So those are all the pros. The cons is you're carrying the liability, as with most prescribed burning on private lands, you do. The other big con is this concept of manpower and resources. So typically, in my experience, doing, you know, private land, do-it-yourself burning, it's a couple people, a couple drip torches, sometimes just with a garden hose that you're using, you know, to burn a little 1/4 of an acre section around, you know, your house or whatever it may be. And then the other con is that you're in charge of figuring out the permits and the air quality compliance. So there's a little bit of a regulatory hurdle, but not bad really. But that's kind of what I would say is the baseline of prescribed fire on private lands in California. So the next option, and one that we also tried to do on my folks' place on a bigger burn, was the vegetation management program with CAL FIRE. And the pro is that CAL FIRE kind of takes the lead, does it all for you, right? So the liability is covered by CAL FIRE. It's low cost. Used to be, you know, it was a cost share program where CAL FIRE needed you to put in lines and feed the crew and do all these other things. Now it's a little more flexible based on the project. Still a cost share. It kind of depends on where you are and what's happening with your local unit. The beauty part is they're very experienced. I mean, CAL FIRE is the best fire suppression agency in the nation, if not the world. So when you're talking about fire suppression and the chance of it getting away, it's very, very, very low. They also cover the permits in terms of air quality and the burning itself, because they're the agency that issues the permits. So those are all the pros. Like basically they show up and just take care of it for you. The cons are that there's limited capacity within the agency because it is the state's fire suppression agency. So if you have a burn scheduled for September in Northern California and Southern California catches a fire, the entire agency sends its crews and people to Southern California to go suppress fire because that's what they do. They suppress fire. So oftentimes your burn isn't completed on schedule because understandably they have prior commitments and their first commitment is to save lives and infrastructures and everything else. So there's limited capacity there. The other con is that there's a lot of planning time and environmental compliance. So the landowners I work with that go through this program are often paying their registered professional foresters to spend a lot of time one-on-one with CAL FIRE to make maps and do site visits and do all these other things. So there actually is a cost there. And then it's not guaranteed it's ever going to get done. But that being said, CAL FIRE as an agency did a really, really great thing recently where I think the previous contracts were a 3-year contract and now they're 10-year contracts. Take that with a grain of salt because I'm not sure on the years, but essentially the contracts have extended to a state at which even if you get pushed back a couple of years, the odds of yours getting fulfilled is much improved. So that's great, and that's just changed in the last year or two. The next one that I think is less known and probably the most underutilized is the private contractor option. It's similar to the VMP option, really, except it costs you a lot of money. So the pro is that the contractor provides insurance, the landowner sets expectations and timeframes. You have experienced crews, similar as you would with the VMP program. Typically, they cover the permits and everything on the regulatory side. The cons is that there's limited opportunity in terms of the number of contractors in the state. And of those contractors, most of them end up going to the Midwest during the winter to be burning in Nebraska and other places. So like there's limited options and availability of those people. And then, the basic cost is the typically the hurdle that people can't get over. It's hard to attract attention with these groups for less than the tune of $10,000 a day, just to pay the actual bills of having all of the staff and personnel that they provide. So that's kind of the hurdle there is the cost. Otherwise, we all would be using them. And then the last option is one that I've been hearing about, for a decade before we really dove into it. And that's the prescribed burn association option. The pro is you're in charge. You do it when and how you want, just like a do-it-yourselfer. It's low cost, like a do-it-yourselfer, because you're asking your neighbors to come help you. Also, don't have a whole bunch of environmental compliance because you're not using state or federal dollars typically, so you don't have to do CEQA or NEPA. And then the equipment and labor is typically pooled and available to the members of the PBA. And if necessary, the PBA can apply for additional funding. And I think the last piece of it that is a pro for the organization, not necessarily for the landowner the day of the burn, is that it's always a training opportunity because you're asking new people, you're asking neighbors are bringing neighbors that haven't done it before. Maybe they're bringing their kids, maybe they're bringing, whomever it may be. Typically there's newbies on every prescribed burn association burn. And I think that is not to go unnoticed, because it's important when we start to think about community-based burning and kind of the tolerance for smoke in the air. So I think that's a really important concept. And then the cons is, again, the liability lands on the landowner. The landowner typically needs to get the permits. And then the biggest con is really somebody has to coordinate, organize, do the pre-site visits. You're relying on volunteers, and volunteers have a limited capacity. So with the PBAs, I think the interesting piece is just that they've been in existence since the turn of the century in the state of California. The model was stolen from California, taken to the Midwest, and sparked in the Midwest, and since has died in California. And now we're trying to re-spark it in California. But what's interesting is when everybody's worried about liability and you start to think about rates and what's actually happening, it's kind of interesting because the fears outweigh the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. So very low escape rates, and essentially nobody's taking each other to court because everybody's in the game to do good things. So that's what kind of grabbed Laney and I's attention when we were looking at this 7 or 8 years ago. And with that, we started weighing the options of the VMP, the private contractor, the do-it-yourself, and the PBA, and kind of what are the success rates, what are the costs, and everything else. So this is a quick summary of what that looks like. And we decided, what the heck, there are no PBAs in the West. Let's go see what it looks like. So we went to Nebraska, and we burned with these folks for a week. 1 year, and then the following year we went back and did it again. And what's interesting to me about it is just how it's part of the culture, and nobody schedules these things. It's just they look at noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They're sitting there eating lunch. Literally, this happened. We're eating lunch at a restaurant, and the leader of the Prescribed Burn Association looks at his phone and says, "Oh, look, the relative humidities decreased 20% from what they were forecasted." He's like, "Let me text 300 people and see if I can't pull a burn off in the next hour." We show up at a burn site for 360 acres, I think. It was about an hour and a half later. And there's 80 people sitting there with their ATVs and their side-by-sides ready to go. It's just part of their culture. And it's really, really encouraging. So we took that model, brought it back to Humboldt County, and we started the Humboldt County Burn Association. And it's a neighbor helping neighbor model. And it's really important, I think, to have a diverse membership. It's helped us a lot with changing some of our air quality hurdles. CAL FIRE has been very supportive, and we use them when permits are required during the shoulder seasons. During the winter season, we don't interact with them very much, other than just kind of courtesy phone calls like we did today, telling them, "Hey, we're going to go put smoke in the air. You don't need to send anybody out. We'll call you if you have a problem." And then we hire private contractors with liability insurance if we need them, and if we just need their expertise and leadership. And then, of course, as University Cooperative Extension folks, we need a research component. So we do research, education, and outreach on all of our fires. And since 2017, we've done 33 burns, which I just updated a few minutes ago because we were out burning this morning. And 1,325 acres. And when you divide 33 into 1,325, it's not a huge number. So I don't think size is really what's to brag about. I think it's more education and building capacity than anything else. And what's interesting is you look at this map here, and the first PBA started in Humboldt County, as you can see in the upper left of the map. And the blue groups are the groups that are formed in burning. And the other groups are the groups that are forming and beginning to burn. And I'm sure I've missed a couple counties in this map, but it gives you an idea that since 2018, when the PBA started,
Can't read it.
it's really started to take off. And I think the interesting piece, or the important piece of it, is if you're interested in starting a PBA in your community, it's really important that you understand your community and build it the way you think it needs to function. Because every single one of these polygons and every single one of these PBAs or range improvement associations looks way different than the next one. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it, is that it's all about what works for your area, and you need to do what's best for your group. That being said, I'm going to go into some of the things that we have done in the Humboldt County PBA, and things that have worked and things that haven't worked. And you can take it as a grain of salt, because I'm sure your community is way different than ours. So some of the lessons learned that we had was that we started burning in 2017 and we didn't form until March of 18. So we had 7 or 8 successful burns before we formed the group. And I think that that was very key to our success, because people were really motivated and excited and wanted to form the group earlier, but we weren't doing anything. And what do you form a group around if it's not actively doing something? You just have a group and a board, and you waste a lot of time having meetings and all these other things. Like, you need to get stuff done and be doing things before you form a group to do things. The other piece is to find yes people and put energy into those people, because as everybody knows, there's plenty of no people around, and everybody knows what no people do. They say no, and then nothing happens, right? The other thing that our group really struggled with was probably 50% of us wanted to be 501c3, but we didn't know. And the long story short was we kind of kicked that can down the road until 2020. And this year we decided that we didn't want to be 501c3 because we didn't need it. And we just wanted to be incorporated, so that way the board members could be covered by board insurance. And it seems to be working. We have a checking account for the PBA, and then we get additional support through partner 501c3s, which is how the grants kind of funnel through to UC or to the Humboldt County PBA. So there's 3 or 4 different partner groups that fiscally manage grants for us if we need them to. And it seems to be a working model that doesn't have a whole lot of overhead and additional kind of headache associated around the 501c3. The other one that every single prescribed burn association or other burn cooperative struggles with is the concept of PPE, so personal protective equipment, and what that requirement should be, or what the training requirement should be to be allowed to be a member. And this is what we did. So what does it cost to be a member of the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association? We have a lot of people who have never been on a burn before, that maybe have 2 acres, 0 acres. Myself, I live in town. I have no acres. So $25 buys you a PBA membership. That gets you fed twice a year at our general membership meetings with beer or other drink. If you want to show up, we require that you have leather gloves. I assume most people have leather gloves. If you don't, you can borrow some. Cotton pants, shirt, and a hat. If you don't have those, you can borrow them. So I'm calling that $0. A tool. If you don't have a shovel or a rake, the burn trailer has a shovel and a rake. I ask that people show up with a lighter, because oftentimes on burns, I go through 30 or 40 lighters at a time, which gets expensive. But a lighter at $1 a piece at the gas station, not a big deal. And then we require no training at all. So to participate in our burns, it's $26 plus or minus, with 0 hours of time before you get there. Different groups have gone different routes, and I'm going to show you the next slide is kind of the extreme. It's kind of the agency route if you want to go on an agency burn. And that is essentially $3,000 worth of gear and 32 hours worth of training to have your basic training before you ever show up, light a match. So if you have somebody in your community that's interested but not committed and just kind of wants to dip their feet in or dip their toes in, do you think they're gonna spend 30 hours and $3,000 to check it out? Like, I argue the answer is no. But are they willing to spend $26 to check it out? I argue the answer is yes. So a lot of these groups are struggling with what's the bare minimum requirement? What is this? What is that? And I think that, I guess my warning to the group is if you are going to start a community-based burning group, be very, very careful about the prerequisites and the PPE requirements. So the University of California is the one, as a state agency and a giant bureaucracy, is the one that created the burn requirement or the PPE requirements for the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association, right? We're talking a state bureaucracy came up with the $26 option, and other state and federal bureaucracies can come up with a $3,000 option. So just be careful where you land and be thoughtful about the fact that it's not free to buy all this equipment, especially for somebody that hasn't done it before and just wants to check it out. So the other one is that, like, we have a lot of these government incentive programs, and they all are great. I don't want to downplay them. I have been part and I've used every single one of these programs, and they are all great programs. But I think that it should be said that they can hinder progress, right? So the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, does grant programs for private landowners. The problem with the NRCS is it's a super slow progress, typically. They require NEPA, but they kind of handle NEPA for you, which is great. And then for the state of California, there really are some crippling state requirements that are not required in any other state in the nation. So other states in the nation, they say, oh, you want to do a prescribed fire? We don't care how the fire gets on the ground. Just go do it. We'll do the NEPA and we'll pay you for it, just like any other process. In the state of California, there's quite a few hiccups in terms of requiring burn bosses and other interesting requirements that are not paralleled outside of the state of California. The other one is the CAL FIRE grants. CAL FIRE has a ton of money. They're going to have more money flowing to them, and I appreciate all their efforts and works. But if you want to get a grant through CAL FIRE and then have them pay for the burn, you have to do CEQA, you have timelines, you have a bunch of other issues. Like, there's just kind of hiccups that aren't necessarily thought through oftentimes before people get money. It seems like after they get the money, they're like, oh, shoot, I got a bunch of money and I don't know what to do with it. And then the VMP process, which I talked about a little bit ago, is it's free. They come in, they take care of it. Again, because they have to deal with CEQA, it's slow and it can be unreliable depending on, the fire season. So what it really comes down to, and what we're seeing in Humboldt County, is we get this landowner base that is kind of standing there with their hands out, just wanting to be paid or wanting somebody to come do it for them. Meanwhile, the projects could be done any day during the winter with 2 to 3 people, but they're standing there like this and nothing's getting done. And it's a little frustrating. So it's like this whole give a man a fish or teach a man to fish concept, right? So is any money good money? And that's kind of my point, is that, well, it kind of depends on the project, right? So Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association has received a lot of money from California Deer Association, and they have been great donors to our cause. And I have nothing but excellent things to say about them. They've supplied us with all of our equipment, very easy to deal with, very helpful. Cal Fire has been very helpful and very generous in terms of the funds that they provided. But we're careful not to take Cal Fire funds for any groundbreaking activity because that triggers CEQA. So we use them for burn planning. We use them to support our volunteer fire department trainings, and we use them for equipment. And they have been wonderful on how much money they've flowed down towards UC and the PBA. The other thing was PBA dues. We asked $25 a member and $200 for an organization. An organization is anything you want it to be, and we're not picky about who sends $25 versus $200. It's all about donations, essentially, and most of that money goes towards the biannual dinners and maintaining equipment. So that's where that goes. But I encourage any group to be careful and weary of accepting grants because all grants come with strings attached. So if you don't need the money, don't go chasing it. That's my take home. So I'm kind of wrapping up here, but as the PBA, Lainey and I started it, and at the beginning it was a lot of hand holding and a lot of helping. Now we have this equipment stash and people come and borrow equipment, and all of these pictures you see are private landowners out burning by themselves with their families in the middle of winter. And this is kind of the goal of our PBA, is we want to supply the equipment and the knowledge, and then have the community kind of take it and run with it and put good smoke in the air. And this is what makes me the most proud, is when we receive photos like all of these and we weren't even invited to show up to the burn, which kind of rubs me a little bit, but ultimately it is the take home goal. And it makes me very proud. And lastly, kind of the core philosophies of our group is that everyone is welcome. I don't care if you're a 20-year-old stud that goes to the gym every day, or if you've been in a wheelchair your entire life. We have a place for you. We need people to take weather. We need people to monitor things. We need people to watch lines. We need people to drive around side-by-sides and supply water and fuel to torches. There is a role for every human on any of our burns. And I think once the group realizes that and encourages it, it really changes the attitude around prescribed fire. And it's not just a macho, dude show where let's go light fire. It really does start to become a good feeling community event, much like a branding would, where there's a role for everybody. And then with that being said, every burn is a training burn, and we're always trying to, even if the neighbor didn't know the burn was going to happen, but starts seeing smoke in the air and shows up, it's like, hey, get out your pickup. Here's a set of gloves. Come on. Let's see what we're doing, So you're always trying to drag people into the scene. And then there's this concept that Lenya drug out of Florida, and it's from a really well-known fire practitioner. And he always says, every day is a burn day. And I love that, because right now, literally tomorrow, in Humboldt County is probably going to be the best burn day of the year. We have RHs that are going to be down to the low 20s, 21. I mean, any understory in the county will burn tomorrow and will burn beautifully. But you'll see very little smoke, and it's because people don't have their smoke management plans in place. They don't have their burn permits in place. They don't have their lines in place. They don't have the torches ready and loaded. They don't have the neighbors ready to go. There's all of the pre-work that they didn't do, and tomorrow my phone will blow up all day saying, Stackhouse, this is a great burn day, we should be burning. And I'm like, yeah, we should. But you didn't use yesterday and the day before and the day before and last week and last month as burn days because you were doing other things. So every day is a burn day, and planning is a huge part of it. So even if it's a torrential downpour or you have 2 feet of snow on the ground, it's a burn day. And think of it as burn day, and maybe just give an hour a day towards burning if you want to get stuff done. And the last part is just get comfortable and make it fun. Because once you're comfortable, it is fun. And once it's fun, you want to do more of it. And that really is what it's all about. So all I have to say, contact information is here on the screen. And if anybody has any questions, feel free if there's still time.
Jeff, thank you very much. That was great. We do have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has a question for Jeff. And Jeff, are you able to stay on and check out the chat if folks have questions as we move forward?
Of course, yeah.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Jeff? If you want to unmute yourself or pop it into the chat box, that'd be great.
Yeah, hi, this is Shelton from Feather River, and I just had one, we're a little gun shy up north in Feather River country because we had an escape quite a few years ago on our own property. It was a great collaborative effort, but getting the $1 million bill from the Forest Service for putting the fire out, it just still kind of shocks us a little bit. So I just, I think everything you're saying is very exciting, but I'm still really worried about the liability, especially around an escape. And in this case, it was our property, but we didn't have people on the ground. We were relying on contractors to do the work. And in retrospect, now I would have made sure we had people on the ground, our own people. But anyway, it's just hard to get over that. So I just wanted to see if you had any comments about that.
Yeah, Shelton, I don't want to take the thunder from Lania because she's talking on that exact issue coming up. But I think that one thing that she'll touch on is some legislative things that we're hoping are going to help with that this year, assuming we get some success on that front. But let me just push pause on that, and I'll be here and I can help Lania, but she's better poised and she has a whole talk about liability just around the corner.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. My name's Steve Cannon. I'm an RPF and also a director of the Amador Resource Conservation District. And I have a number of clients through my consulting business that are interested in prescribed burning. And in my investigations about prescribed burning associations, I have come up with some of these questions like the liability question. But the question that I sent in, I did it through the chat, was you got a burn boss. Okay, where does that burn boss get the training? Who certifies the burn boss? Who does the burn plan in your association? Because I like the idea of the loosely based organization that really has no formal formulation that an insurance company could come after. So if you could answer those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, Steve, and those are great questions. And actually, and it depends on the season, right? So in Northern California, we have declared fire season and then non-declared fire season, right? So
Yeah.
So,
all year round, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, no. So you're not required to have year round. You're required to have an air quality permit.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter because no matter what time of year you're burning, you're putting smoke in the air.
Right.
You're only required to have a CAL FIRE permit during declared fire season. Typically, declared fire season, typically is changing because the fall burns that are happening. But now the new typical is
April
from
15th to November 15th.
That's Bob Broderick, another forester.
That's
What did
me.
you say? I didn't catch him.
No, go ahead. I'm
Go ahead.
sorry.
So now it's from December 15th until the end of April, right? So during that window, you can burn without a CAL FIRE permit. What that means is that you're not required to have the minimum equipment and minimum staffing requirements that you would be required to have under a CAL FIRE permit. So to answer your question, we hire a qualified burn boss, and that's an RXB2, which is a federal standard burn boss. And they typically come with their own $1 million insurance plan. And we meet CAL FIRE's permit requirements of staffing with volunteer fire departments and other groups, including the PBA. So that's in season, declared fire season. Outside of declared fire season is kind of what we call cowboy burning. And yeah, and it can be laughed at, but it really is when we get the work done, because 2 to 3 people can go out and burn 1 to 600 acres in a day. And at 4 o'clock at night, the RHs come, the sun goes down, the RHs come up, and the entire fire just lays down the ground, goes out.
Let me say something.
Okay.
Okay. Hi. I don't know if you can see me.
We got time for one more quick question.
Okay.
Then we need
No,
to
I
move
was just
on.
going to say this is Bob Broderick. Steve and I have been business partners and friends for a very long time. I've got a lot of experience in fire. I was a running hotshot in 1987 on, at that time, the biggest fire in California, which has been surpassed. Done a lot of prescribed burning. And I would just like to say thank you, that it was a great presentation. And what caught my eye was the whole thing about being back in the Midwest, because I taught fire science at Vermilion Community College in Minnesota. And we would go on field trips down to Iowa. And the fact that they had no claims, it's flat. California's not flat. And so and they're not as litigious back there. So anyway, that is probably the biggest thing is the liability and burning on steep slopes with excessive fuel loadings.
Well, let's let Lenya talk too, okay? She's going to give us the liability lowdown.
And having been in some of that country where Jeff's working, there's fairly good slopes in Humboldt County too.
No,
oh yeah.
Really.
That's why I work at Amador County. We only go up to 60%.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff, very, very much. And thanks for sticking around to answer other questions. I'd like to move on now to Chris Paulus, who we'll get to work with tomorrow. But Chris has retired from CAL FIRE here in Placer County and has really been doing now a lot of work on prescribed fire with private landowners and with the Resource Conservation District. Anxious to get out in the field with Chris tomorrow, but Chris is going to talk to us tonight about some of the regulations that Jeff touched on and go into a little more detail on that. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. All right, y'all got me there?
We got you.
Okay. So one of the things about regulations here that we talk about, and Jeff hit upon that, I like the term cowboy burning. And during the non-permitted season in Northern California, again, burn permits are not typically required between the end of declared fire season until May 1. So what that means essentially is that you can go out and do prescribed fire, broadcast burning, pile burning without a CAL FIRE permit requirement. But the other permit requirement that may be out there is going to be an air quality management district permit. And that's slightly different than a smoke management plan. And as you work with each of your AQMDs, air quality management districts, they are going to ask you how many acres you're going to burn and how many tons per acre, and that might push you into a smoke management plan or into an air quality a district permit. So when you look at the area you can do prescribed fire, pretty much an AQMD permit is going to be required anytime during the year. There can be exceptions, and those exceptions can be if it's in a defensible space around structures. And that's where, in the case of Placer County, the AQMD here is very flexible. So you may be doing a prescribed fire, which says an acre or two around your residence or other structures, and it may be viewed as defensible space in orientation. That is, you're providing defensible space for the structures under state law. And that defensible space requirements under Public Resources Code 4291. In that case, a permit may not be required from the AQMD, but generally you get out several hundred feet from a residential structure, that's when require that AQMD permit. When you look at going to when permits required by CAL FIRE, generally May 1 in Northern California to the end of declared fire season is when the permits are required. And there's basically two kind of permits that are going to jump off. The CAL FIRE LE5 permit is going to be for small strips and grass parcels around predominantly residential areas or for large piles. But when you look at prescribed fire and broadcast burning on a larger scale, and we're talking potentially from a half acre to several hundred acres potentially, depending where you're burning and why you're burning, that's going to require an LE7 and LE8 permit from CAL FIRE. And that's where CAL FIRE is going to come out, meet with you, go over the terms of those permits, and go over the mitigations. And that all has to do with the complexity of the burn you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, let's talk about the small scale burn, the less than 10 acres. And let's just kind of focus on a 1 acre burn, and let's focus on a 1 acre burn during the May 1 permit requirement season. At this point, you would contact your local CAL FIRE office. At that point, a CAL FIRE representative, likely the CAL FIRE battalion chief, will come out to your property. You'll meet with that CAL FIRE battalion chief, and then he or she are going to go over the mitigations they want you to do and write those terms into the permit. Once you've met those mitigation requirements, from there you can then potentially move forward with permit. And again, the CAL FIRE chief officer or the company officer, they just permit however they're running their system in the particular CAL FIRE unit. From there, you're going to have a high degree of coordination. So when you look at the whole permit system in CAL FIRE, and going back to my former career with CAL FIRE, it's really about avoiding unwanted fire or uncontrolled fire, about fire escapes. That's really what the permit system is highly focused on. The last thing that anybody wants, particularly you, the landowner, property owner, is wanting a fire to cross onto another person's property and damage their property, which can be both improved property, aka structures, or it could be natural resources, and harm any personnel or whatnot. So you look at what the law says. The law says that you're which means unrestricted spread and burns with such intensity and velocity as to cause a threat to life, property, and natural resources. So when you look at the whole permitting process and the regulatory process in there, that's kind of the focus in there. Is we've heard from Jeff and other folks the issue of liabilities out there. Now, Linya is going to address that issue. But what you're going to find when you look carefully at California laws, and I provided a document here called Understanding Liability and Responsibility in the Use of Prescribed Fire. And what I did, I went through and pulled out several of the applicable Public Resources Code and Health and Safety Code. And I went through those and said, here are mitigations that you would need to do to meet the intent of the law, what a prudent person is, what due diligence is, and desire to comply with the law. So when you get a chance, review that document. I don't know if that document will provide directly in the field tomorrow when we meet. I think it was provided online. Dan, you can confirm that to folks. But within that, I wrote up about 35 different mitigations you can do to control intensity, velocity, and unrestricted spread. And with that, and Susie just confirmed to me, yes, we have copies for everyone tomorrow. And that document will go a long ways to both lowering your anxiety on prescribed fire, lowering the agency's anxiety on prescribed fire. But one of the things that's going to go very well as you work with that fire control agency, likely CAL FIRE, is to demonstrate competency and professionalism to that CAL FIRE individual out there. And the one thing I want to say about cowboy burning, and I really respect what Jeff said there, is bear in mind, even in cowboy burning, when permits are not required, the law is still applicable to you if you have a controlled burn escape. That's a fire that leaves your property and enters the property of another. And as Jeff pointed out, up at Humboldt tomorrow, they're going to have about low humidity is 21% RH. And if you look at, he mentioned a perfect burn day opportunity tomorrow for understory burns, and it is. But bear in mind what the weather phenomenon we're having now with these dry north winds, though it is quote unquote end of March, we're really looking at mid-May burn conditions. Wind permits would be required. So don't get tricked by the arbitrary date of May 1. You have to look at the burn conditions you're working with. And as Steve Cannon there for Amador County pointed out, lots of steep ground. I'm familiar with Amador County. And a south aspect tomorrow in any of the western front of the Sierra Nevada mountain range is going to carry fire just fine, quite aggressively. In fact, it will carry fire with the intensity of mid-May to June 1 burn conditions. And we'll discuss that a little heavily. So when you look at the regulatory process, it's all about following permitting system. It's about contacting the Air Quality Management District to make sure you're in compliance with them. And it's working with that CAL FIRE field office and making those contacts with those CAL FIRE officials. And as Jeff pointed out, what's very critical is try to build that rapport with the CAL FIRE officials, particularly the larger landowners, larger non-industrial timber company holders, things of that nature. If you just happen to be that private property owner that owns that 3 to 4 acres out there, and what you want to do is broadcast burning for all the multitude of reasons there are, just keep in mind, if you're going to be putting up undue amount of smokes, causing potentially a little panic in the local neighborhood, it is good neighbor policy to work with your neighbors and contact your local fire agency. And again, this could be a local fire protection district, it could be CAL FIRE or whatever, just to avoid an excessive amount of 911 calls going into the dispatch centers and overloading those dispatch fire centers, dispatch law enforcement centers. If your smoke release is nominal, no different than a burn pile, you're probably okay. But just kind of think about, do you have neighbors out there that are going to be super stressed out because you're burning? And are you going to be, is your fire visible from, say, a freeway, a highway system where it's going to generate a lot of public potential 911 calls? Just kind of bear that in mind. So that's all part of that burn plan process. Steve asked about burn plans. Who writes the burn plans? Mr. York over there in Blodgett State Forest did an excellent job on burn plans on a UCCE webinar. And really what a burn plan is, and he says, well, have you thought out your fire? And the beauty of a burn plan, and I believe Len, you may address this a little bit in that, if you have a burn plan, that is, you have a thought process to why you're putting fire on the ground, and have you done your mitigations and your precautions and preparations. What that burn plan is, if you will, it's a thinking person's document that goes to, have I thought about this fire I'm going to put on the ground from A to Z, and if you will, from preparation, precaution, through ignition, through mop up, and through patrol. And I have addressed each one of those issues there, so that there are no surprises to you in pulling that fire off. So with that, I just want to kind of keep it short and say the bulk of it tomorrow on what the regulatory process is. And in certain counties, there may be additional permits required. So again, that's where you, contact, work with your local CAL FIRE entity, work with the PBA, and anyone out there on that front, just to make sure there's nothing that doesn't jump out. Most of these agencies are going to be very helpful in instructing what is required, where to go, and who the contact person is. with that, do you have any questions out there, folks?
Chris, thank you. Any questions for Chris? It's going to be great to spend time out on the ground with you tomorrow. Really looking
Thanks, Dan.
forward to that. Any questions on the regulatory front?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy. I have just a small acreage, about 82 acres, and I have blackberries on my dam and down on the back side of the dam. So that's my interest in, because it's probably less than a half an acre, but still, it's not easily accessible to me with my tractor or whatever to clear around it. My question is, you talked about getting an in burn season, getting a CAL FIRE permit, and then you said they would come out and inspect the area?
Yes, whenever you're going to do any broadcast burning, and that's what we refer to as broadcast burning, you don't want to burn out that half acre of blackberries, and it's between May 1 and when CAL FIRE determines permits are no longer required. You're going to tell them the kind of burning you want to do. CAL FIRE is going to come out, and you request that the local CAL FIRE office come out and inspect during that permit requirement season, and then the CAL FIRE representative, he or she, is going to make recommendations to you on how to conduct that burn. That is, they're going to give you the burn permit requirements of what that'd be. And for example, that half acre may say, okay, for example, back in my day, I'd say, okay, I want you and 3 people in attendance. I want the 2 backpack pumps. Over here, for example, your blackberries kind of lead into some pine needles and some oak leaves. What I want you to do is put in a fire control line, a fire break down to mineral soil, and anchor it to the pond over here, anchor it to the dam over here. And that he or she is going to work with you on how to mitigate that burn and to do it safely. And that's what we call the terms of the permit. And the permit requirement is going to be may in part be dictated by the proximity of that in relation to the residents. Now, one thing we got to remember, May 1, and here's the thing that I need to reemphasize this: April 30th, it's raining cats and dogs out there, and you can burn a blackberry leaf with 5 gallons of gasoline, but May 1, still raining, permits are required. So the big emphasis I want to impart, and I know I got CAL FIRE listening in on this, is just because it's an arbitrary date out there, permits being required or not required, proper precautions taken. So blackberries, particularly in your situations, they burn very aggressively. They have quite an understory of fuels of dead canes, and they can throw ember casts quite far. And that's kind of a tricky fuel to burn if you've not burned blackberries before. And blackberry would be something I'd recommend more for a wintertime burn or a real wet spring burn. Just FYI on that.
I agree. Now, other question about the CAL FIRE. Is there a charge for them to come out to assess the area?
There is no charge for CAL FIRE to come out and assess the area. It will do principally with their availability. And so what I would do is try to call CAL FIRE as soon as you want to do this, and give them lead time. Sometimes they can be highly flexible and be out there that day. Sometimes they're very busy with emergency operations and training and other administrative duties, and they may have to schedule an appointment a few weeks in advance. So call the CAL FIRE office and talk to them.
I'm not going to be burning. I'm not going to be burning in burn season and in a non-burn season. But I started to try to burn the blackberries after we had that last all-night rain, and everything was just really wet. And I went out there with a propane tank to try to start the vine, and it wouldn't burn. But I was still scared to get it going, because even though everything is wet, how do I know it wouldn't spread?
Well, that's going to be the focus of our field seminar is making sure you don't have spread beyond what you're trying to burn. And without getting eyes on it, decide to tell you what you need to prepare. Is the key is the blackberries will dry out pretty rapidly within a day or two. of the range. Oftentimes, particularly if it's sunlit and it's on, say, a south aspect that faces the sun, a south-facing aspect, it can burn quite aggressively. But the bottom line is that if what we encourage you to do is set aside what we call a test area, and you do a test fire, and if it's burning the way you want to burn and you feel you have strong control of that burn, then proceed. The mistake folks make is they go out and they try to ignite something that they don't know how it's going to burn, and all of a sudden it's burning far more aggressively than they anticipated, and now you got problems. So we'll cover this tomorrow, but again, having a little test plot set aside, if you'll cut and removed, that you can do a test fire to, and from there you make the decision of go or no go on the burn.
And
I guess
we'll
one of
have
the
some time
things.
we'll have some time to talk about that tomorrow in the field.
Okay.
I think that'll be really, really informative. We have time for one more question for Chris. And again, we're going to get to spend the day with Chris tomorrow, so we'll have lots of time to learn from his experience and expertise. Chris, thank you very, very much. That was outstanding, and really looking forward to tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
All right. So our final speaker tonight is another colleague with UC Cooperative Extension, Lania Quinn Davidson, from also up in the Humboldt County region. And Lania's been fire advisor, fire and forestry advisor there. I can't remember how long now, Lania, but a long time. And we're really happy that you can join us too tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I have been the fire advisor in Humboldt County, I think for 6 years, but I've been with Cooperative Extension for almost 10 years. So yeah, it's been great. Well, let's see, I'm going to share my screen and pull up this presentation. So I was asked to talk today about liability, which is something that's already come up quite a bit. And I think Chris did a great job. What an asset to have Chris there working with you all. I think it's so great when we have people like him to work on these prescribed burn associations and help lead these efforts, who really know fire and really know the rules and regulations and can help you all navigate that. So I'd say you're off to a great start just having those resources and having Dan there and all the capacity you're already showing through this workshop. But today, I want to talk about liability and hopefully provide some clarification, not only on kind of where we stand in California liability-wise, but also on some of the changes that are happening and some of the movement. There are some pretty cool policy things that are happening right now that we could use your support on. So we'll talk a little bit about the current status, some of the, give some case studies about liability, and then move into some of the policy discussion and hopefully wrap it up in less than 20 minutes. So before we start, I just wanted to kind of I actually just made this slide right while I was listening to Chris, because I think it's important for us to think about these things when we talk about liability. One of the really important things to remember is that prescribed fire escapes are actually relatively rare. We consistently see in research on private lands burns, on federal burns, on state burns throughout the country, in California, we see that the rate of prescribed fire escapes is consistently less than 1%. And damages from those burns, from those escapes, are even rarer. So we could talk about a 1% escape rate. That doesn't mean that there was some kind of damage or lawsuit. In fact, one of my favorite fire colleagues, an extension person from Oklahoma, John Weir, who's one of the kind of key people in prescribed fire across the country, he published some really interesting work recently, just last year, of this big meta study of prescribed fire on federal and private lands throughout the country, and showed that the escape rate less than 1%, and that across 23,000 burns that happened on federal and private land, there was only one lawsuit and one insurance claim and one injury. So, this is not, this is risky work, this is dangerous work. We take that all very seriously. Prescribed fire practitioners are some of the safest people I know, but we're not seeing a lot of reason to think that liability should be a central focus. And I'm going to share a blog that I wrote last week about that actually in the chat when I get a chance. And what do we mean when we talk about liability? So, we use that word to kind of throw it around. We're worried about liability. I think most people, when they talk about liability, are worried about damages from an escaped prescribed burn. That's kind of what we mainly think about. Now, if you're an actual prescribed fire practitioner, as I am, or as Jeff is, I would say that I am most worried about two other things. I am worried about injuries to people who come out on my burns. So if I'm leading a burn and I have volunteers, I'm worried about someone breaking an ankle or having anaphylactic shock from a bee sting. Those are the kinds of things that are most likely to happen, and that's a liability issue. And then I'm also worried about putting up smoke and having CAL FIRE respond unnecessarily or necessarily and send me a bill. So suppression costs, whether warranted or not, are a big issue. And so those are the two things that I really think about with liability. I am rarely concerned that I'm going to lose a burn and burn down the neighbor's house or something. That's way less likely. But those other two things are serious concerns. And that's why the communication and the planning is so important. So you heard Chris say that it's always a good idea to call CAL FIRE and let them know if you're putting smoke in the air, whether it's permit season or not. It's a good idea to make sure they know what you're doing, and that if they're concerned or they're getting calls, they can just call you and ask if everything's okay. You do not want them showing up worried and sending resources if they don't need to. And if you have a burn plan and you're really thinking things through, then that's going to position you really well to not be as concerned about liability. So you'll see through this talk, there are ways we can mitigate liability. This is not impossible. This is really doable work if we put our hearts and our minds into it. So I like to start this talk just helping people understand the national framework for liability. There are generally 4 categories that states fall into when it comes to prescribed fire liability. They're on the kind of least conducive to prescribed fire end of the spectrum, as you see on this chart, is strict liability. These are states where no matter what happens, if something goes wrong and you cause a problem and you cause damages, you will be held liable. And you can see on that little map that there are only a couple states that have strict liability laws for prescribed fire. There are states that have undefined liability. So they just don't actually have anything in their law that refers to liability. There are many states, mostly in the middle of the country, that have that situation, and they tend to default to a simple negligence standard. Now, a simple negligence standard means that you have to be shown to have been negligent in order to be held liable for damages caused by prescribed fire. On the kind of most conducive end of the spectrum are gross negligence states, and there are a handful of these. I think there are 5. In those states, it's kind of like simple negligence, only better, because you have to be shown to have been grossly negligent, like showing reckless disregard, in order to be held liable for damages caused by prescribed fire. We in California are a simple negligence state. So it's really important to know that, and it's interesting because sometimes you'll talk to CAL FIRE people who are totally, they don't totally understand this, or you'll talk to other people, or you're just a Californian, you're used to us being one of the most bureaucratic and litigious states, and you're like, we must be a strict liability state. That's just what makes sense. But no, we're not. We're a simple negligence state. So it's good to know that. And you can see that in our public resource code. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. But what is negligence? I think we all kind of know what negligence is, but in a legal sense, this is language provided by a lawyer who I've worked with quite a bit on prescribed fire related stuff. And negligence really refers to acting with due diligence and doing what would be expected of a reasonable, prudent person who's trying to comply with the law. So if you were brought to court and someone was trying to prove that you were being negligent, they would point back to this language and say, were you doing what a reasonable prescribed burner should be doing? And they would bring in witnesses to try to verify that. So we see in our public resource code that these terms of negligence and willful negligence, these are scattered throughout our health and safety code and our public resource code. Exercising due diligence to control the fire. I can provide, Susie has actually a document that I've put together that has all the the pieces of our public resource code and health and safety code that relate to prescribed fire. And I think it's just helpful to read through and kind of understand where this stuff is coming from. But it's all about negligence and due diligence. And Senate Bill 1260, which passed in 2018, provided some really helpful language about due diligence. It didn't change the law, but it did add this little piece, which you'll see at the bottom of this slide, that compliance with a permit issued pursuant to this article does constitute due diligence. So if you have a permit in hand and you are actually in compliance with the different parameters of your permit, you are practicing due diligence. We didn't have that in the public resource code before 2018. So this was a really helpful piece of clarification. It's something you could point to if you're a practitioner and you're complying with your permit. So that's all good stuff. And Senate Bill 1260 did a lot for prescribed fire, which I'll talk a little bit more at the end of this presentation. I think it's helpful to look at one of the more recent cases of prescribed fire liability, which was there was a case, this Massa in 2018. It was resolved, and this centered back on a burn that happened in March of 2014. And this was down in the Central Coast region. It was a chaparral burn in March, and it did escape control. This was a rancher who was doing a burn on their property with a couple other people, burned onto the adjacent landowner's property and was declared a wildfire, and it burned 190 acres in 4 days and did require a significant CAL FIRE response. So it was a very expensive incident, and CAL FIRE did go after that landowner for suppression, administrative, and other costs. And that totaled, more than $500,000. So this is one of those situations where the landowner did get a bill, and of course had to be involved in all of that suppression. And it was a big mess and a long lawsuit. So we worked with this lawyer, Sarah Clark, who works with the firm in San Francisco, and I really wanted to understand kind of the facets of that case and what does liability look like when it plays out on the ground. We all talk about liability, we know about simple negligence, but what does that actually mean? And so she dug into this a little bit for us and helped us understand it. And there were some interesting issues. So the landowner did have a permit, and so they had those parameters outlined, but they did not comply with the conditions of the permit. And this is really important because if you have a permit, that due diligence piece, right, you need to be complying with the permit. They did not burn in the area that had been permitted. So they had a permit, but it actually didn't even include the area that they were burning in. They had constructed control lines actually on the adjacent landowner's property, which I don't think was part of an agreement with the neighboring landowner. So that was a problem. And their containment lines didn't meet the conditions that were outlined in the permit. So that's a problem. And I'll talk a little more about what you can do if you're, feel like your permit's not how you want it. There were some additional issues. They did not have communication among crew members. So they had no cell service and they had no radios. They had actually no way for the different people who were on that burn to communicate with one another. We know that's a huge issue. One of the most important things on any burn is to make sure people can communicate. Because if something goes wrong or someone gets hurt, you have to be able to communicate. There was no ignition plan. They hadn't talked as a group about how they were going to conduct the burn. So it was a little bit of a free-for-all, and that of course caused problems. They had a dozer on site with known fuel filter issues. So when the burn actually escaped the neighboring property, they went to fire up the dozer and it didn't work. And they actually knew going into the burn that it might not work. So that was a major problem. And then they made a decision not to report the fire because they thought they could get it out themselves. And so they waited many, many hours and actually into the evening to call CAL FIRE and report that, that they had lost control. And at that point, it was too late for CAL FIRE to bring in any kind of air support. And that actually caused it to extend over multiple days. So all of these things played into the lawsuit and were part of the finding that the landowner was negligent. And so the landowner was charged for a portion of the costs associated with the wildfire. Now, one of the interesting things that I heard is that the landowner was not charged for the full amount that CAL FIRE was seeking. And part of that reason may have been that the landowner had notified CAL FIRE and could have had CAL FIRE there to provide contingency resources. But that didn't happen, I think, for a variety of reasons. But this brings up an important issue for, I think, any private practitioner. We need to know that according to Public Resource Code 4491, we can request contingency resources from CAL FIRE. And if they're available, if your unit has resources available, then they do need to provide those to you to support you, or even just to sit there and help if something goes wrong. So I think this was really useful for me. I know for my burning that I do here in Humboldt County, just to know that I have that right to request CAL FIRE support. And much of the year, especially during this time of year, they are available and they could provide support. And I think that would have really helped in this case. So the landowner did have to pay part of that, part of those costs, but not all of them. So I just think this is a really useful example, and it's one of the more current ones we have in California for this example of negligence. So when we think about that case and just, about all the other things that go into conducting a prescribed burn, I think it's important to think about the ways that we can mitigate liability. We can include neighbors in the planning and implementation of projects whenever possible. And this is something that I think prescribed burn associations really help facilitate, because it's about neighbors helping neighbors, people getting on the same page, people understanding that if we do good work on our property, it's going to help the neighbor's property. So we always try to bring as many partners in as possible on these projects, and always obtain and comply with relevant permits. So if you're out there burning without a smoke management plan when you should have one, that's going to come up. If you get into trouble or something goes wrong, they're going to start looking at, did you have the permits? Were you complying with them? Those are all really good ways to show that you're being diligent. Like, hey, we had everything we needed. We were really following, something weird happened and something went wrong. Make sure you have those permits and that you're complying with them when they're needed. Now, also think about planning and that you've prepared your unit adequately for the time of year and the conditions under which you'll be burning. So you heard Jeff talk about when we're doing burns in season that are more complicated, then we'll have a much more robust burn plan, and we might hire that private federally qualified burn boss. And, we might do any number of things to prepare for that burn. The burning we were doing today, which was burning some kind of half-burned piles in a research project that had black all around the outside, we were much less concerned. And you always have to kind of get a sense for the project that you're doing and what level of planning and preparation is going to be commensurate with the risk that you're taking. So if you don't know that and you're just getting into this, that's when you want to tap people like Chris to come out and look at the project with you, or your CAL FIRE partners to come look at it and help you understand what you need. Now, when it comes to the injuries for the participants, especially in the Prescribed Burn Association model, where we really do accept anyone and welcome anyone from the community to join us, we do have release of liability forms. And we have a really good template for that we're happy to share with any Prescribed Burn Association that's starting up. But have people sign those. They can acknowledge the risk they're taking. They want to be out there. I mean, people don't show up on a burn unless they're excited to be there and that they feel like, it's worth their time. They don't mind signing a release of liability form to help protect the landowner or the burn boss. So make sure you have those if you're going to have a lot of volunteers. And then request that CAL FIRE send some contingency resources if you want to. We didn't do that today, but we often do that. And it's great. They often have a really good time. It's fun to build those partnerships, and it's great to have them in case something happens and something goes wrong. So there's no harm in asking CAL FIRE to send an engine out to sit with you while you're doing your burn. And then just be thinking about what kinds of things would show that you are being reasonable and prudent and really taking your work as a prescribed fire practitioner seriously. I think at the end of the day, this liability stuff, it really does come down to just being thoughtful about your work and building those partnerships and communicating and doing what you need to do to make sure that that you're covering your bases. And I am really curious about that Forest Service example that one of the participants shared earlier, and thinking about how all of the liability stuff does relate to the federal, suppression response, because that must have to do with CAL FIRE's relationship as well with the feds and who's got the protection of certain lands. But that's an interesting case. I'd love to hear more about that. Now, Jeff and I did put together a little 2-pager on liability. I don't know if that's something that Susie's going to share with y'all, but it's just helpful. It kind of summarizes some of the things I talked about in this presentation, and especially those ways of mitigating liability. I think it's really helpful just for thinking about that. Now, some of the policy changes that are happening right now are pretty exciting and could shake up some of this liability conversation in California. One of those things is the development of a state certified burn boss program that has been in the works since 2018. It was mandated by Senate Bill 1260. And so I highly recommend, if you're interested in nerding out on some policy stuff, go look at Senate Bill 1260, read through it. But one piece of it was that California was required to develop a state certified burn boss program. I was selected to serve on the curriculum development committee for that. That took about 1.5 years, and the whole thing is just getting approved, and we're planning to roll it out this year. And so we're hosting the first course for this in May here in Humboldt County. And what this is going to do is it's going to certify, the state of California is going to certify really highly experienced prescribed fire practitioners as burn bosses. And those people, certified individuals, will have the opportunity to share liability with CAL FIRE through a special agreement process for certain prescribed fire projects. And so we're still kind of waiting to see what exactly that looks like, but it will open up some opportunity for liability sharing, which wasn't there before. So it is exciting. I'm hoping that it'll become more exciting through some other policy work that we're doing. And I'll skip right down to Senate Bill 332, which was introduced by Senator Bill Dodd this legislative session. It's currently in the legislature being reviewed, and it's a really big deal. Senate Bill 332 would change the liability standard for certified burn bosses from a simple negligence standard to a gross negligence standard. And this is something that we see in states like Florida and Georgia, places that do the most prescribed fire in the country have this exact setup where a certified burn boss or a certified burner enjoys a less strict liability standard. And what it is it's a way of the state saying, hey, we've got your back because you are doing such important work, and we know you're taking personal risks to advance the benefit of all of society, and we're gonna cover you by giving you a reduced liability standard. So I am working on this. I'm really excited about it. I think it is the #1 way that we can make prescribed fire happen on private lands in California. And we need letters of support for this bill. So if you are at all interested in supporting this and really trying to just increase and proliferate the use of prescribed fire on private lands in California, please reach out to me, and I'll provide you with a template support letter. It's really important. Now, the prescribed fire insurance issue is also a big one. Prescribed fire insurance is mostly unavailable to landowners, to certified burn bosses, to federally qualified burn bosses. Insurance it's a huge gap in this whole picture. And it's something that is a policy priority. There are people working on it. It's a conversation in the legislature and within the Department of Insurance, and a lot of people are talking about it, but so far nothing's really happened on that. And I think that's even more reason why we should pursue this gross negligence standard for the state certified burn bosses. So just to show you, this is what I'm really hoping we move toward, is this gross negligence standard for the certified burn bosses who we are, as a state, we are certifying them. Let's give them some benefit to incentivize this work. So with that, I will end. Please feel free to email me, and if you're interested in that bill, if you're interested in the state certified burn boss program, I'm kind of taking the lead on that. So feel free to reach out. Lots of good stuff going on.
Lenya, thank you. That was outstanding. That was great. Thank you very, very much. Any questions for Lenya before we wrap up tonight?
I'd just like to comment on Lenya's, this is Steve Cannon, like to comment on Lenya's comment about the liability insurance. Because I was getting mixed messages from Department of Forestry, the battalion chief here in the area was going, yeah, let's do burning, let's burn. But then the unit forester in Camino was going, are you out of your mind? You shouldn't be doing this. And so I went and talked to two insurance agents, and they told me that yes, your homeowner's insurance will cover the damages. A fire goes off of the property that you're prescribed burning, they'll cover the damages. But the big but that came out of these two conversations was that, say, like Allstate or Farmers or whatever would then turn around and say, okay, who can we recover the money from? And that's the big deal is that, say, like the burn boss, if the burn boss is carrying $2 million of liability insurance, then that's good. But that costs. And if CDF is out there providing backup and the fire still gets away, then they're going to go for the deep pocket. And that, this is just reality in California. So that's just my comment.
And Lenya, I see that you put your blog post up, a link in the chat, and we'll share that with everybody that's signed up as well. So thank you.
I'll just make another comment real quick, and that is that as a resource conservation district director, I will send a letter of support to the state, to our local assemblyman and state senator, and say, let's back this bill.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. That would be great. We've seen a lot of support from RCDs, and I think that's awesome. That's what we need. Anyone, even if, even just landowners, like any letters help, because it really shows that people care about this issue.
Lenya, there's a question in the chat about liability regarding smoke and folks with respiratory problems.
Yeah, let's see. Liability thoughts regarding smoke-related respiratory. I think that's a good question. I don't know of any lawsuits or anything that have resulted from something like that. But I will say that smoke impacts are a big thing that prescribed fire practitioners think about. And some of the communities we work with have done pretty innovative things to try to protect sensitive, community members. So providing air filters, giving really advanced notice about, if they're going to have periods of prescribed burning where they're expecting smoke impacts, so that people can do various things, either get out of town or get an air filter. So I think there are things we can do with outreach and just communication. It all comes down to communicating what we're trying to do and protecting each other, and that always helps.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions for Lenya or for any of the other speakers? We're going to have time with Chris and with others tomorrow. And I know Lenya and Jeff are more than happy to answer questions by email. And so thank you both very much for taking time tonight to be with us.